a fascinating story. An event happened with a man who was Zohir in the mitzvah tzitzits. Zohir in the mitzvah tzitzits means he was very scrupulous. Chazal defined him as a person who was very meticulous in this mitzvah. But apparently, despite the fact that he was meticulous in that mitzvah, there were some other mitzvahs that he was maybe not so meticulous about. Shamashi Zona Bekarche Hayam, he heard that there's a prostitute somewhere in a distant island, Shenatelas Dalad Mehel Zuvim Bischara, who requires 400 zehuvim, 400 coins for her schar, a fortune of money. Shigala Arba Mehel Zehuvim, he sent the 400 zehuvim. The Kaval Zman, he set a time. Kiyazmana, when the time came, Ba, he came. Yashav al Pesach, he sat on the opening of her house. Nichnasa Shivchasa, her maidservant, entered Va'amar Law. She said to the Zona, to the prostitute, Oso Adam, that man who sent you the 400 zuz came, he's waiting at the entrance. Amrahi Yikhan, the Zona said, let him come in. Nichnas, he entered. Yitzilo Zayin Mitos, she prepared for him 7 beds in ascending order. 6 were made of silver, and the final one was made of gold. Between each one was a ladder made of silver. On the very top one, she sat waiting. He came in. He took off his tzitzits. He began climbing up the ladders. When he got to the final bed upon which she laid, his tzitzits miraculously came off of the ground and slapped him in the face. 1 tzitzit, 2, 3, 4. He immediately jumped to the ground and he sat on the ground. She, being alone up there, didn't know what to do. She also comes down and says, I'm not letting you leave until you tell me what flaw have you found in me. And he said to her, I have found no flaw. I've never seen a more beautiful woman than you. But we have one mitzvah, the mitzvah of tzitzit. And 2 times Hashem says in it, Ani Hashem Elokeichem. One time he says it, Ani Asiv Lifare. And one time he tells us that I am the one who in the future will punish you. Vanihu Sha'asiv L'Shalem Schar, and I am the one who will pay reward. These tzitzits appear to me as 4 edim, as witnesses to that fact. At which point she says to him, I'm not letting you leave until you tell me your name, the name of your city, the name of your Rebbe, and the name of your Beis Medrash. He wrote it on a piece of paper and he walked out. At that point, after he left, she took all of her wealth. She was apparently quite wealthy. 1/3 of it she gave to the kingdom as a bribe to allow her to leave. 1/3 she gave to the poor people. 1/3 she took with her. She came to the Beis Medrash of Rebbe Chia and she said, Rebbe, Siva alai v'asuni giores, tell me what to do so that I can become a convert. Amallah, Rebbe Chia said to Biti, Shema einecha nasata be'echa min hatalmidim, maybe you place your eyes upon one of the students. Are you being megayer? Are you converting for marriage? She took out that piece of paper from her hand that had his name, the name of his Rebbe, named Reb Chia, and the Beis Medrash, and she gave it to Reb Chia. Unfortunately, explained that Reb Chia then saw Baruch HaKodesh that she was destined to him, and he said to her, Zechi b'Mekkecha, go be zoche in your Mekech. She converted, she became Jewish, they got married, meaning this woman and the man who had gone to her earlier, and those very beds that she had brought to him, the Isser, she now prepared for him in Heter. Says the Gemara, this is the reward for being careful in the midst of tzitzit. Okay, a very curious Gemara. But let's ask the obvious question on this Gemara. When Chazal used an expression that a man was Zohir b'mitzvah tzitzit, that means he was meticulous. He steiged in that mitzvah. It was his mitzvah. He literally made it a part of him, and he was exemplary in the way he performed that mitzvah. Now, why would a man take a mitzvah and make it his mitzvah? You hear stories of Gedolim, you hear stories of Tanaim who picked a particular mitzvah and they were almost fanatic in their observance of it. But why would a man do that? There's only one reason you do that, because you recognize the value of a mitzvah. It changes me. For eternity, it makes me into who I will be. So here's the question. This man is holding on a certain madriga. He's a Ben Torah. What is he thinking? I mean, let's pay attention to the story. He hears about this Zona, this prostitute, far away, somewhere on some island. She asked for 400 zuz for her fee. 200 zuz is the amount we sign on a ksuba. 200 zuz is approximately a year's support. Let's call it $25,000. That means to say 2 years' support he sent to this prostitute somewhere in some Yenek Welt, some foreign island over there. It's not like sending money ahead of time to some hotel in Mexico. He doesn't know who she is. He doesn't know if she'll honor the money she was given or not. And he's got to travel. He's got to travel for weeks, maybe months. First by foot, then maybe by camelback. Then he's got to get on a boat. She's on an island. So he's traveling, spending huge amounts of money. But he's a Zahir b'mitzvahs. He's a person who's growing. To the extent that when he falls on the floor, after the tzitzit smack him on the ground, what does she say to him? I'm not letting you leave until you tell me, who is your Rebbe? What Beis Medrash do you learn in? How did she know he learns in the Beis Medrash? The answer is he was a Ben Torah. He looked the part. He was the part. So what was he thinking? And if you don't hear this question, look at the Sfas Emes on this Gemara. Sfas Emes explains, what does it mean that he's Zahir b'mitzvah tzitzit? And the inyan of mitzvah tzitzit is ureisem oso. You shall see them, and they shall remind you of the rest of the mitzvahs. But the Sfas Emes points out that there's an anaf, there's a branch of that mitzvah. Right after those words, it says, Lo sasuru achrei levavchem va'achrei einechem. When you look at the tzitzit, one of the effects of it is to remind you not to be looking where you shouldn't be looking. When it says that this man was Zahir in the mitzvah tzitzit, it means he constantly was involved in it, constantly looking, constantly uri'isim, also constantly thinking about it. So we're dealing with a man who's Zahir in the mitzvah, a man who's a Ben Torah, a man who's steiging. What in the world is he thinking? He's not overcome with taiva. I can hear a man who's overcome with lust. He has to plan, travel for weeks, use some money. What is going on is in his thought process. And I believe when we focus on this Gemara, I believe it will help us understand a bigger picture that's very, very nogea to us. And to do that, I would like to do something that we rarely do. And that is to try to understand us. What makes us tick? What makes us work? How does the human personality actually function? And let me point out some obvious contradictions. Do you ever notice you can be davening Shemona Esrei, literally speaking to Hashem right there, having a conversation, speaking to the Creator of the heavens and the earth right there, and then 2 seconds later, you're gone. Miles and thousands of miles away, and you don't come back until you take 3 steps back. Where am I? Oh, Shemona Esrei. Oh. You ever notice that sometimes I can be the nicest, sweetest guy in the world, and sometimes I can be a creep. Here's the problem. I'm not a Dr. Jekyll or Mr. Hyde. I'm not a psychopath. Catch me in the right mood. Catch me in a generous mood. I'm nice. I'm kind. I'm magnanimous. Catch me in a bad mood and say the wrong line in the wrong time, and I change. And the problem is that we're all like that. We all have these different dimensions, these different parts to us, and what's shot? So we've discussed this in previous Shmuzim, and you've probably heard parts of this before, but it bears repeating. And the Chovos HaLevavos explains that when Hashem created the man, Hashem made 2 very different parts. A nefesh sichli, a pure neshama, mixed in with a nefesh apami, with all of the animal instincts that you'll find in the animal kingdom. Part of me is pure, brilliant neshama. Part of me feels the holiness of a Shabbos. Part of me wants nothing other than helping other people. Part of me is utterly, totally selfless. And part of me couldn't care less. When another Jew comes to me with his problems, there's an entire half of my personality that says, I don't care. I can't care because it's not in my interest. There's a full half of me that says what's in it for me, because there's a full half of the I who's speaking to you that am utterly, completely nefesh bahami, pure animal instincts. Go into the animal kingdom and you'll find every animal has all of the needs, desires, and instincts to keep it alive and to bring about the next generation. The baboon, the camel, the orangutan has all of the instincts that it needs for its survival and to bring about the next generation. No wisdom, no das, but instincts. Part of me, a full half of me, is exactly that. Instincts, drives, and desires. And I, who am speaking to you, I who thinks, am both mixed together, constantly in contradiction. And if you'd like to be critically honest with yourself, you'll see this exhibit itself over and over and over. And I'll share with you one example that I find very telling. When my wife had our first child, she put on a little weight, and she was very concerned about it. And at a certain point, I said to her, listen, if you decide you want to be heavy, I'm okay with that. You want to be thin, I'm okay with that. But what you're going through isn't healthy. You see, my wife went on the sit diet. Now, I don't know if you know what the sit diet is, but the sit diet basically consists of the following. You take a wedge of chocolate cake, you take a Diet Coke, fork in this hand, Diet Coke in this hand, you say the words, I'm so fat, I'm so fat, I'm so fat. You consume the entire wedge of chocolate cake, drink the Diet Coke, and that's a sit diet. It's called self-inflicted torture. Now, my wife is one of the sharpest people I know, and it was a little out of character, but she went on the sit diet, and she was going through this whole routine, and at a certain point I said to her, we got to stop. It's a choice, but we got to make the choice. My line is, it wasn't going anywhere, so I took my wife to Weight Watchers. Now, this was quite a number of years ago. We were first newly married, and in those days, very few men showed up at Weight Watchers. In fact, I was the only man in the class. Okay, I'm a young cola guy, sitting in this Weight Watchers group, and I got a chance to experience something very eye-opening. The leader got up in front of all these women and said, okay, ladies, tell me about your week. One woman raised her hand. Oh, my week was going great, but then somebody brought chocolate cake. Oh, chocolate cake, everyone moans. Another woman says, I was doing great, but someone brought Lay's potato chips. Oh, potato chips. Oh. Another woman says, donuts. No. In front of my eyes, these ladies were losing it. Now, here's the question. Madam, what's the problem? You made a cognitive decision that you're not going to eat more than a certain amount of calories. Just close your mouth and don't do it. The problem is that part of her made that conscious choice, I will not. And when the bag of potato chips was brought in front of her nose, a full half of her personality said no. But there was another half that said yes, no, yes, no, yes. Ah! And she was in utter, complete contradiction. Now, I found this brilliantly eye-opening. Why? Because as B'nai Torah, certainly as yeshiva guys, I experience that every day of the year. That's life. A constant battle between I want and I don't want, I do and I don't. So make up your mind. There are two parts of my mind. Part of me utterly, completely rejects it, and part of me deeply craves it. And that's the battle of life. But here's the interesting question. Find me a woman who has a lot of trouble dieting. Find me a man who has a lot of trouble controlling his appetite. How is it that somehow, on Yom Kippur, he fasts the whole day? Won't touch a bite before Shacharis. On Shabbos, before Kiddush, won't eat anything. The same guy who smokes 2 packs a day can't stop himself. The entire Shabbos, 2-day Yom Tov, 3-day Yom Tov, doesn't touch a cigarette. But how could it be? If we dig in a little bit more deeply into the I think we'll see a tremendous yesod. You see, even though Hashem made 2 parts of the I, it would not be sufficient to allow for bechira. You see, if Hashem created us with a brilliant neshama and a pure animal instinct part of us, we would not have effective free will. Why? Because, to be honest with you, I don't do heroin. Why don't I do heroin? Because it's damaging, it's destructive. You could read all kinds of books that tell you it's great and it's high and it's wonderful, but I'm just not doing it. I don't drink bleach. I don't do drugs. Why? Because it's foolhardy. It's damaging to me. And in the same way, there is a part of me that would never, ever act in an imperfect manner. There is a brilliant neshama within me that says, what do you mean you're going to act like a selfish creep? What do you mean you're not helping other people? What do you mean you're acting in your own interest? What's wrong with you? And there's a powerful voice within me, my neshama, that would never let me sin. It would only drive me to do what's right, it would only drive me to do what's proper, and you and I would not have free will. To allow for free will, the Baruch Hu introduced another component into the equation. That component is something called imagination. What's imagination? Imagination is that fanciful flights that we so naturally take. You ever read a novel? You're engrossed, you're in it. And it's the 17th century, and you're a pirate, and you're swashbuckling on the... What are you doing, man? It's a book. Just reading a story. What are you getting all emotional about? And if you're not sure that I'm right, ask someone who's gone to the theater and started crying. Man, what are you crying about? It's a play. It's a script. And it happened hundreds of years. What are you crying about? You know why you're crying? Because when the event is happening, it's not happening to the actor. It's you in the scene. You're envisioning, you're imagining that you're on that pirate boat. You're the one who's climbing Mount Everest. You're in the scene. And the reason why you cry or get scared or get attached to a story is because you're in the story. And the only way that happens is because Hashem put within us this fanciful thing called imagination, and we're able to feel it. We're able to literally feel like we're there, and we sort of know that we're not, but yet it changes our emotions. We feel terror or love or happiness or depression because it feels like it's us going through those events. And because there's this factor called imagination, now there's free will. Why? Because now there is this ability to believe exactly what I like to believe. Now there's this ability to sort of know it's not true, but sort of, I don't know, I'm not sure. And now there's real free will. Let me give you a little example. Muhammad Ali was once on an airplane, and the flight attendant asked a few times to please fasten your seatbelt. No go. One budge. And the flight attendant comes over to his chair and says, please, sir, would you mind fastening your seatbelt? Superman don't need no seatbelts. The flight attendant, without missing a beat, said, Superman don't need no airplanes. At which point, Muhammad Ali fastened his seatbelt. Now, folks, I want to ask you a question. Did Muhammad Ali really believe that he was Superman? Oh, sir, do you mind if I pull out my revolver and shoot a couple of bullets off your chest? Because, he didn't really believe he was Superman, right? Well, he didn't, but it was enough to explain away certain things, like, I don't have to fasten seatbelts because I'm Superman. You don't really believe it. Well, you do and you don't, and believe it or not, we human beings have this uncanny ability to believe the most absurd, illogical, ridiculous ideas. I've mentioned this before, but a good book to read is the Alcoholics Anonymous book, the big book, because you get to see private logic. What does private logic mean? Private logic means logic that I and I alone understand, and no other human being understands it. I'll give you an example. One of the alcoholics tells a story. He knew he was in dire straits, and he decided he had to stop because he kept getting drunk. And every time he touched a glass of whiskey, he would get so drunk that he would get sick and wake up days later oftentimes, and he realized that another drink could be the end of his life. And he made up a total resolve to quit, and he quit. And he was clean for 3 months. He was on a business trip, went into a restaurant, and ordered a sandwich, and ordered a glass of milk. And then a certain logic hit him. Wait a minute. I just had a glass of milk. If I had a glass of milk, so whiskey can't bother me if I had a glass of milk at me, right? So he drank the milk, ordered a whiskey, And in fact, he was good. So he ordered another glass of milk and another whiskey, another glass of milk and another whiskey, another glass of milk and another whiskey, and woke up 3 days later almost dead. Now, aren't you a fool? Do you really think that milk is going to change the amount you get drunk or don't get drunk? It's private, personal logic that I and I alone believe because I want to believe it. If I said it to a jury of my peers, believe me, they would laugh at it. But it's just enough for me to hang my hat on, and we do this all the time. And I'll share with you some interesting examples of just this. I get a call from a guy very recently who's recently married, and he says to me, you know, Baruch HaShem, things are going very well, marriage got off to a good start, everything's good, but she's not from. I said, what? She's not from. This was a little strange. I knew she was a regular Beis Yaakov girl, and when they were going out, he called me up with shilas and etc., and I didn't know what he meant. I said, what do you mean she's not from? He said, listen, we went to Great Adventures, and there was no place to wash, so she took the bread and just started eating without washing. It's the strangest thing, he said. I mean, she'll eat without washing, but Lashon Hara, she gets all upset about. Anybody who speaks Lashon Hara, she gets all bent out of shape, all nervous, I can't say anything around her, but she eats bread without washing. It's the strangest thing, she's not from. At which point I said to this young man, I'd like to make you a bet. I'll bet you she's on the phone right now with her college teacher saying, you know, he's a great guy, you know, he won't ever, you know, eat the bread without washing, but he speaks Lashon Hara all the time. I don't know what's with the guy. You see, we have two different sets of values. Interestingly enough, we have almost two Shulchan Aruchs. There's a Shulchan Aruch that stays in the Beis Medrash, and there's a Shulchan Aruch that we take with us. Kind of like the Melech. You know, the Melech had two Sifrei Torah, one that stayed by him in the palace, one that he took out with him. We have two Shulchan Aruchs. There's a Shulchan Aruch written by the Beis Yosef, and then there's our private, personal Shulchan Aruch. What applies to me, what doesn't apply to me, what mitzvahs I have to keep, and which ones they're not me, they don't apply, they're not binding upon me. And if you think I'm joking, I'm not joking. Let me give you another example. A fellow worked in a frum office. There was a luncheonette area with a coffee machine, etc. So he brought in a bottle of milk. He brought in a bottle of milk and he put it in the refrigerator. And when he came to his lunch break, he found that the milk was gone. Some other people, for their coffee, took his milk and there's nothing left. And he's pretty upset. The next day, he brought in the same bottle, but on it he wrote a note. Makbid, please do not take my milk. Put it in the fridge, went to work, came out lunchtime to find the bottle empty. Chutzpah, I wrote about. And next day he brings a bottle, and on it he writes the word Gezel Gomor. It's stealing. If you take my milk, I'm makbid. It is Geneva. And he comes to lunch and finds the bottle empty. He's livid. Oh, chutzpah, I wrote, I'm not, what's with these people? The next day he brought in the bottle, wrote a sign on it, Chalav Stam. He came to lunch and found his milk still there. Would you like to know why? I'll explain. It's very simple. Listen, that's milk. Maybe the guy's makbid, he writes there, whatever. I'm not the frummest guy in the world. Come on, I want milk, my coffee, and but he has a right to be makbid. I shouldn't have delicious coffee because he's a shnook. So I take it. Chol stam. I'm not a goy. I'm not going to drink chol stam. That's mamish. That's an isser. You see, gezel, stealing is whatever, you know. But chol stam, that's forbidden. And that sounds very humorous, doesn't it? And I would agree it's humorous if it weren't for the fact that if you go in my car now, you'll see one of the GPS settings are for Otisville, New York. Because I go there often enough that I want to make sure I get there. And I'll share with you what my first experience in Otisville, which is a minimum security federal penitentiary, was. I came to visit someone. And someone else, who I didn't even know was there, comes over. Rabbi Schaefer, hi, do you remember me? No, I was in your high school. Oh, it's great to see you here. There's a Daf Yomi. No, there are two. No, there are 3 Daf Yomis in Otisville. A minyan 3 times a day. You can steig, you can grow all kinds of shurim. 30, 40 guys. And you walk in there and you see them. From guys. What a chilul Hashem when I see the guard and I see from what looked like B'nai Torah. And I'm not kidding around about learning 3-4 hours a day. That guy who came over to me told me, I haven't learned this much in my whole life. And you can get a great shear there because they're Magidei shear who know how to learn. How could it be? It's really quite simple. There are 2 Shulchan Aruchs. One in the Beis Medrash and there's my personal one. And there are certain rules that are crossed out of my personal Shulchan because you know why? It's me. Mora lo heter means I teach myself the heter. It's not mutter. It's not really permitted. For me, it's a little different. For me, I have my own set of standards. I'm not saying it's the greatest thing in the world, but come on, it's not really usser. And my friends, this is something that you see all the time. When it gets to those levels, it becomes glaring and obvious, but it's something we do all the time, and I believe that's pshat in this Gemara. Would you like to know a pshat in this man who was Zohir b'mitzvah tzitzit? He was steiging, he was growing, he was a Ben Torah, and he was learning all day. And he had a weakness. So how could you do it? You're planning for weeks, you spend 2 years' salary, and you're going for weeks, how could you do it? You know how I could do it? That's my weakness, it's my area, and it's not really forbidden. It's not really usher. And it gets whitewashed, it gets painted over, and it's okay, whatever, listen. Don't worry about it, it's okay. He wasn't gripped by taiva. He wasn't pulled by some huge, it was a good thing that he was involved in. I might as well enjoy it. I'm a connoisseur. This is my inyan. And he steiged in it. And if it sounds contradictory, it is, because we human beings are utterly, totally, completely in contradiction. And one of the most important reasons that Hashem gave us a Yom Kippur, gave us a Seresh Teshuvah, is for us to take stock. And one of the things that we should be doing is looking back at our own lives, our own ways, our own actions, and asking ourselves, how much falseness, how much sheker have I introduced into the equation? How many times have you walked away from a situation and said, yeah, I was wrong, the other guy was right, we were screaming and yelling, but I was wrong and he was right. You ever notice every time you get into I'm always right, the other guy's a jerk and I'm not, and how can that be? Always? And each of us have our areas, each of us has our personal Shulchan Aruch in whatever area it may be, and we can be very, very fastidious, very meticulous in many areas, and really be holding. And there can be glaring holes, but we don't see them, because we have this flight of fancy, this thing called imagination. For me, it's a little different. For me, I have my own standards. And one of the things that a Jew should be doing on Yom Kippur, really doing all of Elul, is reviewing his year, looking back on his ways, asking himself, how much has seeped in, how much has crept in of my personal Shulchan Aruch, and a lot of thinking should be going on. And if you say, I don't really need to do that, because I'm a Ben Torah, I'm learning hours a day, I daven with a minyan 3 times a day. I don't need that. I'd like to share with you an example of what happens if you live without a business plan. What happens if you live without taking stock? What happens if you live without checking yourself every once in a while? If you ask historians, and if you ask economists, what was the greatest invention in the past 1,000 years? Most people will tell you that the printing press changed mankind's existence. The information revolution that we're familiar with began with the printing press, because before the printing press, the average man could not afford a book. In Europe, the average home didn't have a book, because a book had to be handwritten by a scribe. And the average person could never afford that amount of money, and information was at a dead standstill. When the printing press was invented, it changed everything. Books were published, people read, libraries were formed, information now flowed tremendously. Arguably the greatest change, maybe in 2,000 years, maybe in even longer, was the printing press. How did it come about? A fellow named Gutenberg thought about this idea. 10 years planning. He tried different ways. He was a goldsmith. He tried different ideas, different ways. After 10 years, he came up with a plan. And he had to invent 3 separate technologies. He had to invent the press. He had to invent movable type. And he had to invent a specific type of ink that would stick to the paper under the pressure and not smudge after. He perfected it. He took out a loan and he began his operation. The first printings he began doing for the church, for signs and leaflets, and then he got ambitious and he printed the Gutenberg Bible, 2-volume Bible, and he printed 200 copies. It was a revolution. It sold for a fraction of what a handwritten Bible sold for, and after printing 200 Bibles, he ran out of money. And he had to sell the press, sell the ink, sell movable type to the person who loaned him the money, and the rest of his life he sat there as a worker, working away, slaving away at a common laborer's pay rate. The man who came up with the greatest invention in 1,000 years that changed civilization was a pauper because he didn't have a good business plan. He didn't have the foresight and didn't have the vision to figure out what he would need and how he would get there. And my friends, I think that is an apt mashal for us. Hopefully, we're growing, we're accomplishing, we're B'nai Torah. We have a lot going for us, and we're learning. And we have a sense of, listen, I'm not saying I'm a tzaddik, and I got things to work on, there's no question about it, but basically, I'm in a good place, in a good way, and I'm okay. And you might be, but you might not be. And you'll never know it. Because we are the most nogea b'davar, we are the most afflicted with blindness, self-blinded, and we can't see our flaws, can't see our direction, can't see what we get involved in, and we are clueless, blind as a bat. Explains in the Shalom 2 mistakes the darkness of night causes to the eye. Either you don't see the pitfall and you fall into it, or worse, you see a pillar and think it's a man, and you mistake that which is bad for you, and you say it's good, and you lust after it, you crave for it, you drive yourself to get it, not realizing all the while that it's destructive. And there's a lot that a Jew should be thinking about on Yom Kippur, a lot of our life that we should be taking stock on. And I'd like to apply this concept to one area. I don't mean that it should only be limited to this, and it isn't. But there's one particular area that I think should be thought about, besides everything else. That is the use of technology in our lives. Now, all of us are wise enough now to recognize that technology is a tremendous bracha and also comes with a very real cost. And all of us are also wise enough to realize that if you let your kids on the internet without a filter, you are literally taking a handgun and putting it in their possession and saying, a little Russian roulette, go for it, guy, come on. You know, a little hot war story to share. I got a call a few months back from a fellow in England. He's very troubled. Why? His son went to his cousin's house, and the 2 boys were watching pornography on an iPad. Now, you may wonder, it's the 21st century, I know it's a problem, it's an issue, but what does the guy have to call me all the way from England? What's ma kol Rosh Gadol is it? The kol Rosh Gadol was the age of the 2 boys. They were 7. 2 7-year-olds were on the iPad watching pornography. So again, it doesn't take a rocket scientist, it doesn't take a great moralist in our days to recognize that there are tremendous dangers. Most of us spend hours and hours and hours in front of a screen in one form or another, and you have to be very wise. And one of the things you should be thinking about on Yom Kippur is, what have I gotten myself into, and what could I do to change it? What safeguards can I put up? What modifications can I make in my schedule, in my ways, whatever it may be, because all of us have to deal with that. And the obvious danger of technology is taiva and everything that it pulls us to. But that one, well, again, we should think about, I think is a little bit obvious. But there's a second area that may not be as well known. I'd like to share with you some Roshei Tevos. Beis Lamed Aleph Gimel. Beis Lamed Aleph Gimel. You may wonder, what do those Roshei Tevos stand for? Beis Lamed Aleph Gimel stand for Beli Emes Ugvul, without truth and without limit. It also refers to the word blog, because blog is Beli Emes Ubeli Gvul, without truth and without limit. Go to a blog and see the rant, the absolute sewer pipe that opens up with the name of human beings signed to it. And to watch people go to various sites, and some of them even have Jewish names to them, and you see the blogs and you see the rants, the sewer pipe opened up, and recognize that you spend hours involved in Lashon Hara and destructive. I know personally, because some of the Shmuz articles end up on different sites, and people ask me for content. Sometimes I offer content, and I get comments back. And if it's a comment from off the Shmuz, I know to read it very guardedly, because the audacity, the azus that people write with, the obscene, I don't mean nivel peh, I mean just the absolute chutzpah, I can't describe it. And most of the time I don't respond. Because if you're not speaking like a human being, I'm sorry, I'm not responding to you. And somehow it is, in this world of anonymity, we put our name or not name, and people write things and express things. And if you're spending an hour, 2 or 3, the Bittul Torah, the waste of your life is amazing. The damage that you do to yourself and to others is great. And it's something to think about, because it sounds kosher, but it's not. But there's a third area. A third area of technology that I think is probably not as much discussed and not as well known. And that is the danger of technology that's always in your pocket. Whether it's a smartphone, whether it's not such a smartphone, it absolutely, totally consumes the human. How many hours a day, how many times are you answering the phone or the email or the text when you shouldn't be doing it, and it grips you and it gets you. And I'll share with you an example of what I mean. A fellow asked to speak to me, and I said, sure. We set up a time. He came down and said, first thing he said, Rabbi Schaefer, I know you're busy. Thank you so much for giving me this time. Okay? We began speaking about what was going on, and he was going through an awful lot. A very, very rough story. And as he's getting into his story and telling me his woes, he reaches into his pocket and sort of, I'm sorry, and he goes back to his tales of woe. And then as he's going on, and it gets worse and worse, a few minutes later, again, he pulls it from his pocket and then goes back to the story. And when it happened the third time, I said to him, thank you. Thank you very much. I said, what do you thank me for? I said, thank you. You just helped me make a decision. I had a BlackBerry, and my email was on my BlackBerry. I said, because of you, I decided to take my email off of my BlackBerry. Because to watch a man who's spooling for his life, and he's really racked in pain, and even that, when he values the person he's speaking to's time, he can't give him uninterrupted attention because I got the email. And when you watch people, when they're supposed to be with their families, aren't there. I mean, they're physically there, but they're not there. I've been in the park, and I've seen young fathers with a smartphone on Facebook. The cutest little kid, playing with the ball, playing on the floor, but daddy ain't home. Daddy isn't there. Daddy's on Facebook somewhere in cyberspace, and he's just not there. And it's all consuming, and it's always there. And if you don't think I'm right, studies now show that teenagers, how many texts do teenagers send? So they say that the average teenager today sends 4,000 texts a month. 30 days in a month, that 125 a day. Are they conscious for 12 hours a day? 10 an hour. That means constant interruption, constant involvement. You know what ADHD is? Impulsivity, lack of attention, and hyperactivity. You're being trained in exactly that, impulsivity and lack of attention, because you're constantly being pulled, and you're training yourself. And brain studies now show this. The Shallows is a book that spends 2 chapters on showing the MRI studies that demonstrate clearly that you train yourself in the inability to live in the moment. And it's the opposite of what a Ventura should be doing. Calm, focused, thoughtful living. I'm so distracted. I'm so busy running and doing and constantly having to be pulled from here to there that not only don't I have any menuchas nefesh, there's no semblance of sane, conscious living. And we do it to ourselves. So I want to teach you a chiddush. I have on my phone the greatest invention in the world, and you might have it on yours as well. It's the off button. And my phone's even better, because my phone says goodbye when I hit the off button. What a sweet sound. And when you come home from work, you push the off button, so that you're not checking your email or your phone or your text during supper. And when you're doing homework with your kids, guess what? The phone's off. In Dodge City, there was a rule. When you came into the saloon, you parked your gun at the front. You couldn't bring your gun into the saloon. We should make such rules. My wife says especially we make such rules in the homes. You leave your cell phone out the door. Shut it off and leave it in your car. Why? Because your kids deserve your attention. Your wife deserves your attention. Your family deserves your attention. And your learning and your davening and your existence deserve your attention. And if you don't answer the phone and it gets picked up via voicemail, you call that person back. And it's not the end of the world. And don't think this is a little thing, because it's not. It's very, very worthwhile to review our days, our weeks, our months, our year. One of the biggest parts of Yom Kippur is supposed to be just that, a review. And to ask ourselves now from a dispassionate place, stepping away from the busyness, trying to remove ourselves from the lies and the sheker, trying to forget the busyness of our generation and ask ourselves, what am I doing? Am I happy with my growth? Am I happy with my life? Am I accomplishing that which I set out to? Am I now a year older? Am I a year wiser, better? Have I grown? And what areas can I change? There's a holiness of the day, there's a kedusha, there's a readiness in a Jew's heart, and you can understand things that you can't understand during the rest of the year. The fast has a magical effect. It clears your head. And somewhere around Maftir Yonah, 2, 3 o'clock in the afternoon, when the fast starts hitting, that's when the brain gets clear. When the body gets weak, when you're shvach and you have trouble, concentrating, that's when your mind is clearest. Why? Because that's when your body is functioning at its low ebb. And that's when it's no longer as strong, it doesn't block your vision, and that's the time to pull out your year, pull out your days, pull out your relationships, and start reviewing. And asking yourself, what am I happy with? What am I not happy with? This Gemara in Menachos is very illustrative, because this man was Zahir b'mitzvahs. Chazal gave him an accolade. They gave him a title of honor. A man who was meticulous in a mitzvah means a man who was growing a ben Torah, and he did something that you and I would say couldn't be. How could he do it? That's the fanciful flights of imagination. I have my own Shulchan Aruch. I have my own system. We all do it in our own way. And I think it's a tremendous lesson to us. And something that's worthy to think about. I'd like to close with one last observation. Aaron Ralston was an outdoorsman. He was a very active young man. He used to run, he used to bike, he used to hike extensively. He one time went on a hike in Utah, in a very, very remote, very deserted park. He rode his bike 30 miles and then began hiking out. He knew the area, but obviously it was desolate, but he was a very trained outdoorsman, and he was well equipped for it. In any case, he's walking and he gets to a canyon, 2 walls, and he starts making his way down, and at a certain point there's a rock that's wedged between the canyon walls. He steps on this 800-pound boulder, and as he steps to the edge of it, somehow as he's stepping down, he dislodges the rock, and the rock begins tumbling down. He falls down, and the rock smashes his hand against the canyon wall. And it's jammed, because the canyon is pretty skinny, and the rock is jammed in, and his hand is literally pinned under an 800-pound boulder. He was a very put-together guy, and he started doing the thinking, the calculations. What could he do? he tried to invent a pulley system. He had a backpack with ropes and he invented a pulley system. But he couldn't budge it. It was 800 pounds and it was jammed in. He had a pocket knife with him. He started chipping away. Didn't go anywhere. He had no cell phone. No one knew where he was. He wasn't expected back for days. But even once he was known to be missing, no one had a clue to where he was. He had about a day's worth of water, a little bit of food, and a cheap pocket knife. And he began counting down the time. He tried this idea, that idea, that idea, and that idea. Gating it, it wasn't going nowhere. He ran out of water, and on the 5th day, at night, he took his pocket knife, and in the canyon wall, he etched out the words, "Rest in peace, Aaron Ralston," and he wrote the date. He knew that he was going to die that evening. He didn't die that evening, but he did wake up in the morning delirious, and he realized something very, very interesting. His hand had been pinned for 5 days. It was totally, completely numb. There was no blood flow whatsoever. His hand was dead, and he realized it. But there was one advantage. Because his hand was dead, and therefore numb, he wouldn't feel any pain. So he took his camelback tubing and tied a tourniquet over the top of his arm, and he said to himself, if I break the bones and cut through the flesh, couldn't I just escape? And that's what he did. He broke the bones of his arm, took his cheap pocket knife and began cutting through. And he describes the pain like electricity searing through with every motion. And when he got to the nerves themselves, indescribable, unbelievable pain. But he succeeded in cutting off his arm. He climbed out of the canyon, walked 7 miles, and finally found someone. They called, medevaced him out, and he survived. Here's the question. Imagine that it's you in the canyon, 800-pound boulder, pinning your hands to the wall. Do you have the guts? Do you have the courage? Do you have the strength to cut your arm off to save your life? Interesting question, no? Well, I'd like to share with you the answer. I sincerely doubt it. Because I don't think Aaron Ralston had the courage either. You see, when his hand got pinned to the wall, he thought about every single possibility, chipping it and creating wedges, creating different types of pulley systems. He obviously was aware of the fact that he could cut his hand off, but that was so absurd that it wasn't in the realm of possible. But something happened during those 5 days. His version, his understanding of life changed. Because you see, when you're on the edge, and you're on the edge for day 1, day 2, day 3, life becomes precious, becomes more precious. You realize that you may not be here anymore. And that thing that you were so accustomed to called living in existence, all of a sudden becomes very chaviv, very dear, very precious. And he was a different person by day 5. And he was a person who desperately needed to live and was ready and able to do anything, something that I doubt he could have done on day 1. And the reason why I think that is very, very nogea to us is because one of the thoughts that a Jew should try to keep near to his or her mind is the fact that I am a mortal human being. And it means many years from now, hopefully, but I don't know how many, I will no longer be here. And what that means in plain, simple language is I, as every other occupant of the planet, will die. And what that means in very simple terms is my body will be put in the ground, and I will separate, and for eternity, I will be what I shape myself into. And with that understanding, I recognize that every moment of life is precious, because I can change, I can grow. And when a Jew thinks about the fact that I'm mortal, my time will come, has a different understanding of life. There's a preciousness to life, and there's a value to it. And if you think about that, and you really put that in front of you, you begin to have a different understanding of what life's about. And then you review your days, review your weeks with the question of, am I happy with where I'm headed? Am I happy with what I'm accomplishing? Am I happy with my relationships, the way I daven, the way I learn, the way I treat others? And you review your days, and you come up with a plan, and you have a very, very different trajectory that you head on. you grow and you accomplish. And Hashem grant us wisdom, the ability. May this be a very meaningful Yom Kippur. May this be the last year that we spend in exile